Welcome back to Polygamy. An enemy has done this. We're continuing to talk about biblical polygamy, and today I wanted to start us off in a place that has a lot of culture. All of us are born into a culture, not just our family culture, but also the culture of our society and our faith. Cultures aren't really good or bad. Every culture has some or much good because every culture is created by children of God who have been endowed with the light of Christ. But because we're in a fallen world, every culture also contains elements that entice us away from Christ. This is true for each of us today, and it was certainly true in the time of the Patriarchs. God calls each of us to transcend our cultures, to overcome this fallen world. Not to abandon our brothers and sisters, but to abandon our false beliefs. And when we abandon our false beliefs, that will allow us to create Zion, a society where the people are of one heart and of one mind. Some of us have more cultural baggage to overcome than others, and this is my home environment, so I include myself in that category and acknowledge that I'm still trying to identify which parts of my culture I need to transcend and which parts that I should be holding fast to. Blessedly, God does not condemn any of us for needing redemption in our quest to overcome the world. And the patriarchs needed redemption just as much as you and I do. One of the indicators that someone has entered into covenant to overcome the world is that God gives them a new name, which of course we've seen Satan counterfeit when he bestowed the title Master Mayhem upon the first murderer and the first polygamist. Now, Adam, Enoch, Noah, there's nothing in the scriptural record about these prophets receiving new names. Interestingly enough, that's also the case for Isaac. Is that because they didn't enter into covenant? Or could there be another explanation for that? Can you think of one thing that these men had in common that Abram and Jacob didn't? Or perhaps one thing that is conspicuously absent from every ancient account and teaching about Adam, Enoch, Noah, and Isaac that is present in Abraham and Israel's stories? We'll get back to that in a few minutes. In the meantime, I'm going to tell you the story of two brothers, Jacob and Esau, who, because of cultural influences, both became entangled in the worldly snare of polygamy. We'll keep covenant language in mind, notice whether either brother sought divine extrication from the abomination of polygamy, and look to see if God delivered. Remember that Rebekah was barren, and if she had hearkened to the law of the land like Sarai did before she and Abraham entered into covenant with God, Rebekah could have given Isaac a maidservant to bear him children, and it wouldn't have raised an eyebrow among the neighbors. But Isaac had been born in the covenant and was taught the ways of God by Abraham and Sarah. So it should be no surprise that Isaac had learned from his parents' experience, and may we all be as willing to let our children learn from our mistakes. Isaac had learned how to not handle infertility. Women's bodies are not to be used for fertility purposes. That's not who women are in the plan of salvation. We are men's physical and spiritual partners in the plan, fully equal. Whether Rebekah even offered this slave surrogacy option, we don't know. We only know what Isaac did. Isaac entreated the Lord for Rebekah, and the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah conceived. Something felt very off during her pregnancy, and she took it to the Lord, who told her that she was carrying twins and that she carried two nations inside of her. God revealed to Rebekah that the elder child would serve the younger, and perhaps that informed her later actions. There is evidence, and this story is a key contribution to that body of evidence, that women anciently exerted matrilineal authority, by which they conferred inheritance on deserving heirs. So God revealing to the mother which child would ultimately be the heir is in line with this theory. The boys had an auspicious birth, with Esau all red and hairy and Jacob grabbing his heel on the way out. As someone who has learned through experience how profoundly symbolic our physical births are, I believe they are the first ordinance that we receive. I love physical births and how little details like this demonstrate that we all show up with a personality and witness to our existence before this mortal life. The boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, and Jacob was a plain man, dwelling in tents. Other biblical translations describe Jacob as quiet, a bit of a homebody. As these boys grew, they, of course, both shared the same family culture. But here we can see that Esau was a smart and successful man of the world. He was out and about, bringing home the bacon, so to speak. And remember, the world Esau navigated did not have a Christian worldview. Recent scholarship has made the case for how deeply and dramatically the life and teachings of Jesus Christ have altered our world, from the laws of nations to literature to everything in between. The societies that flourished before the Word was made flesh were not predicated upon the Golden Rule, or even the rule of law. This idea we seem to have, that if something happens in the Bible that is uncomfortable or foreign, then it must be because it's part of a higher law that we are not spiritually mature enough to comprehend, that just doesn't withstand scrutiny. Polygamy was so at home in pre-Christian culture because the work of polygamy, where a man is approved to have sexual relations with multiple women, fits like a glove in a society that believes some people are worth more than others, and that certain relationships entitle people to use others for fertility purposes. So Esau successfully navigated that culture and provided well for his family's needs. And Isaac was a proud father who appreciated the fruits of his son's labor. And what happens next, based on every Sunday school discussion of this that I've ever been in, I think we all feel hesitant criticizing Esau because we don't go out and hunt for our own food. When we're hungry, we all have an abundance of food at our fingertips. That would be presentism, though, if we interpret this story through our modern-day lens. As we just discussed, Esau lives in a different world. Notably, this is a world of birthrights, which is another one of those ancient cultural practices that later became codified as religious law. We don't see birthrights in the antediluvian period, the time before the flood. I always like to check my religious assumptions against the recorded practices of Adam, Enoch, and Noah's day, just to see if there's continuity. The religious rites of that time included baptism, sacrifice, and monogamous marriage. And I would argue that the people of this time also had an expansive understanding of women's authority. But I don't see birthright. It does seem that Isaac's inheritance from Abraham at the end of his life was a birthright, which he received not as the oldest, but as the covenant son, while Abraham's other children just received gifts. This is just kind of to point out how cultural practices can be absorbed and evolve to fit religious understanding. So Rebekah received a revelation while pregnant that Esau would serve Jacob, and that revelation may have influenced the way she treated her sons and planned for their future. Jacob had been observing Esau since the womb, and if Rebekah didn't tell Jacob outright, he probably intuited his mother's perspective as well. I think this story clearly demonstrates that Jacob doesn't think his brother deserves the double portion of the inheritance that was his right as the firstborn. He'll just blow it, he probably told himself. And he's probably right, but wow, brothers, they can be so brutal. Esau wants instant gratification, so he takes Jacob up on his offer. This makes me think about what Joseph Smith taught about sign seekers, that it's an adulterous desire because it comes from a need for instant gratification. Esau is the kind of guy who wants his physical appetites immediately gratified. And then there's a famine, so a tiny bit of indication for Esau's hunger. Rebekah and Isaac need to move, but the Lord does not want them to go to Egypt, perhaps because that is the designated place for Jacob's son Joseph to go as savior for his family. They stay in Philistine territory under the rule of King Abimelech. Even though there's no indication that King Abimelech worships the same God, he is a pretty honorable guy, and so I assume Isaac and Rebekah and their boys wanted to be accepted in this culture. And since Esau and Jacob were there, quote, a long time, end quote, that culture affected their perception of the world and how things should be. The locals seemed threatened by this family and viewed them as other, and their wealth made them doubly suspect. Eventually, peace was brokered, and as soon as that happened, Esau married 2 women. No reason is given, so we can only speculate Esau's motive based on the little information we have. Perhaps this was Esau's way of restoring himself to a position of worldly success, like he had formerly enjoyed in his hunter days. Perhaps Esau had never grown out of his need for instant gratification, and after being without a wife for 40 years, he reasoned his sexual desires justified 2 wives. Perhaps he believed his father Isaac's visions, that God would make his seed to multiply as the stars of heaven. And Esau knew that certainly couldn't be accomplished in monogamy. One thing that should be obvious is that Esau is not breaking the law of the land. He's not doing something forbidden by his culture. It's totally fine in the world that he lives in. And while we're speculating about Esau's motives, I want to reiterate what I've said in other episodes. If you want to believe that polygamy is godly under some combination of circumstances, there's still space for you to have that faith. The space for that faith is right here in the Old Testament, pre-Christian world. This is the only ancient record in our scriptural canon that gives you leeway to have that faith. So if you want to justify polygamy, you have to read these stories in a very specific way. I'm trying to demonstrate how these stories can make sense if polygamy is an abomination, which I believe it is. So I'm looking closely at details that we usually gloss over and moving quickly over the parts that don't cast extra light on it. Now, in my opinion, Esau's reasons for polygamy don't matter, because the actual problem with polygamy is this. Polygamy is outside the covenant, because the crowning ordinance of the covenant is monogamous marriage, where a man leaves his father and his mother to cleave unto his wife, and those two become one flesh. By engaging in sexual relations with more than one woman, Esau has broken the covenant. You can read the next verse and say that Esau married women that Isaac and Rebekah didn't like. That's why they were so upset. I think Isaac and Rebekah's grief is because Esau has broken the covenant. They're bitter about it, as the footnote and other translations show. For 2 generations, this family has really had to swim against the current. And now look, their firstborn son just swan dived into worldly culture. Yeah, they're bitter. I think many parents today can relate. Despite the anguish Esau caused his parents, Isaac had a soft heart towards him, and perhaps Isaac assumed that the firstborn son should always receive the firstborn blessing, regardless of his lifestyle. That's just the way it's done. Now, if Rebekah had matrilineal authority, then she had the right to designate which son would be given the covenant blessing of the firstborn. And remember that she received revelation while pregnant that the younger son would be served by the elder. So for their entire lives, she's been watching her boys to see if this bears out. At this point, Esau has sold Jacob his birthright, and he has married polygamously. With just this information, we can see that Esau has utterly disqualified himself to receive the blessing of the firstborn. So Rebekah arranges things so Jacob receives that blessing. Esau is, of course, infuriated by this, and I think every mother of sons is familiar with hearing, "I'm going to kill him!" So she decides to send Jacob to stay with her brother Laban. And side note, Rebekah does not want Jacob to marry a girl from their community because she does not like the sort of women this culture produces. And so Isaac called Jacob and charged him to not take a wife from their area. And pay attention, because the assumption is that Jacob will only marry one woman, a wife. Don't take a wife here. Go to Laban's and, quote, take thee a wife, end quote, from his house. And in doing that, the blessings of Abraham will be with him. So it says it right here. The blessings of Abraham and Isaac are predicated upon obedience to the covenant. And the covenant is monogamy. And Esau, my heart hurts for Esau, because despite his cunning, the cultural scales of darkness have really blinded him. Esau heard that his father didn't want Jacob marrying a local girl, and that Jacob was leaving to go marry within the family. So Esau went to Ishmael, and he married one of Ishmael's granddaughters. That makes 3 wives for Esau. From his perspective, he seems to be thinking, "Look, Dad, I'll marry in the family too. Aren't you proud?" And it's so sad because he totally missed it. Meanwhile, Jacob headed toward Laban's, and on his way he had a visionary dream that we refer to as Jacob's ladder. This dream is short, but the concept of ascending and descending is dense, and I really love Tim Merrill's discussion of it on his blog, Owl of the Desert. I'm linking to his post about this in the show notes if you're interested in an expansive look at this topic. Jacob also learns that his father's God is not like the others of that time who are bound by geography. Genesis 28:16. Jacob didn't realize deity worked this way. This God will be with him wherever he goes, and through Jacob, all the families of the earth will be blessed. You have to wonder why this family was so special. I personally believe it was because they kept seeking God and were eventually, individually, brought up. They ascended and found rest through a covenant relationship with God. After that vision, Jacob vowed that if God will be with him, keep him in this way that he's going. And just want to mention again that Jacob is going to marry a wife, singular. That's the way he asks God to be with him in and keep him in. So Jacob vows that if God will be with him in this way, give him bread to eat and clothe him, so that he will again come to his father's house in peace, then this will be Jacob's God, and Jacob will tithe 1/10 of all he has given to this God. So, with the blessing of his fathers and his God, Jacob went on his way to marry, quote, a wife, end quote. And his meeting with Rachel is so beautiful. In verse 11, we see that he greeted Rachel with a kiss. That would be the familial greeting that we see he received from Laban in verse 13. And Jacob wept. He must have been overwhelmed by how well things were working out. I mean, one minute he's fleeing for his life, and the next he meets the girl of his dreams, which is what makes the next part of the story so tragic. Laban, let's talk about Laban for a minute. While scriptural guys named Lamech are kind of a mixed bag, one established polygamy and became Master Mahan, the other was Noah's father and taught him how to be a son of God. Laban's in scripture seem to be selfish jerks. That could be my presentist bias, of course. Now, Jacob might not have known much about his uncle Laban and how profoundly Laban's values would affect him. We get a clue back in Genesis 24, when Abraham's servant came to town looking for a wife for Isaac, and in his joy at finding Rebekah, the servant gave her a lot of jewelry. Check out Laban's reaction in verse 30. When Laban saw the earring and bracelets upon his sister's hands, and when he heard the words of Rebekah his sister, Laban said to Abraham's servant, "Come in, thou blessed of the Lord. Wherefore standest thou without? For I have prepared the house and room for the camels." I feel like if this were a cartoon, you'd see the dollar signs in Laban's eyes. Ka-ching. We don't know how familiar Jacob was with this family story, or rather what it revealed about Laban's character. We know that Jacob worked 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days for the love he had for her. And then, the switcheroo. I can't even imagine the look on Jacob's face, the disgust, the horror, when he realized what had happened and the larger implications. I haven't been able to find a work of art that captures it, nor how Leah must have felt. I think every unmarried woman dreads becoming a Leah in the eternities. I know one of the ladies in my ward does. What a nightmare to think that that could be your eternal destiny. Now, when Jacob confronted Laban, "What have you done to me?" Notice Laban's reply. He basically said, "Hey man, this is how we do things in our culture." And this is so obviously a polygamous culture. And Laban played the polygamist game just as it's always played, by using his daughters as currency. Now Jacob was planning to pay for one woman with his 7 years of labor, but Laban used Jacob's righteousness against him. He knew Jacob was an honorable man, and once honorable men have sexual intercourse with someone, that bonds them. And as we saw in the Code of Hammurabi, the ancient world had laws about how a man would have to care for a woman he had intercourse with, deception or not. So Leah would have had legal claim upon him as a husband. So Laban leveraged the law and Jacob's righteousness to his own advantage. Jacob worked 7 years to marry Rachel, which was good, but Laban negotiated even better terms. He got 14 years of labor from Jacob, which Jacob would have never agreed to had Laban not deceived him. And Laban got to marry off both his daughters. This is an absolute win as far as worldly Laban was concerned. And the other way you can tell this culture is polygamous is because there is no indication that Jacob won't also be able to marry Rachel. Not even a whiff that this could happen. Of course he could still marry Rachel. Lots of men marry two women in this culture, just like the one Jacob came from, where Esau did the same thing. That's why this is no big deal to Laban. Just wait a week, try to get Leah pregnant, and then you can marry Rachel, as long as you agree to keep serving me for 7 more years. Can we just, for a second, stop and praise God that we live now and not then? Our cultures today have problems, but the rising tide of Christianity has lifted us all. And thus begins a time of descending Jacob's ladder. Jacob did his best with the light and knowledge that he had, and with the women he was bound to. As we know, it was a standard cultural belief during this time that some people are worth more than others, so some people can be owned and given to others, and that certain relationships entitle people to use others for fertility purposes. And that is exactly what happened in Jacob's story. Michelle Stone says the women turned themselves and their slaves into weapons of mass reproduction, which just perfectly describes the absurdity and horror of the situation. After 20 years, God delivered Jacob from Laban's house in a dramatic escape. And Jacob was told, quote, "I have seen all that Laban doeth unto thee," end quote. God saw Hagar, and God saw Jacob. God sees those who are ensnared by forces beyond their control. And as we see over and over, God is merciful to all who will accept mercy. God came to Laban in a dream, because even though Laban was kind of a selfish jerk, he loved his daughters as much of a man of his culture could, and he needed deliverance from this situation too. Laban overtook Jacob's fleeing family, and thanks to God's intervention, their confrontation was brought to a resolution when Laban proposed that they make a covenant of peace in the sight of God. Notice that part of the covenant in Genesis 31:50 is that Laban basically threatens Jacob with divine retribution if Jacob afflicts his daughters or takes any more wives, because Laban has seen firsthand how polygamy hurts women. And then Jacob, Rachel, and Leah and their servants and children went on their way, home to where Esau lived. When Jacob talked to Laban, he acted like he'd been forced to stay all that time under ill treatment. But at this point in the story, you get the sense that Jacob has not been very anxious to get home. He thought there was a good chance Esau would follow through on his promise to kill him. And so Jacob attempted to pacify him with gifts. And then he cried out to his God for deliverance. His appeal is so beautiful. He's not worthy, but this is where he is. This is what he's got. Can God deliver this family? In a bid for mercy, Jacob sent his family ahead of him. And verse 22, for those who like to claim Jacob had 4 wives, nope, he only had 2. The other 2 women who bore him children were the slaves of his wives, just like Hagar was Sarai's slave. Polygamy and slavery, those twin relics of barbarism. I think these stories really illustrate that they are a match made in hell. When Jacob is left alone, he wrestled a man that Hosea said is an angel, but these verses in Genesis indicate it's actually God. And I want to talk about this encounter for a minute and offer an interpretation. Sacrifice has always been a principle of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Animal sacrifice, which began with Adam, was intended to point people's hearts to Christ. And when Christ came, he asked for the sacrifice of a broken heart and a contrite spirit. Now, Jacob, in that wrestle where he eventually received a new name, he didn't need to have his heart broken. He didn't love multiple women, even if he was physically cleaving to them. He just loved Rachel. So it isn't Jacob's heart that needs to change. It's his walk. Jacob's sexual behavior is off. He needs to be brought into alignment. To justify him, God modified Jacob's hip so that he could walk with God. By that time, Jacob probably had some very good and compassionate justifications for fully living out his family arrangement. He never wanted to be polygamous, but certainly did not want to abandon the mothers of his children. These scriptures tell me that it was hard for Jacob to change his thinking. It was a wrestle, but Jacob prevailed over sin and accepted God's way. This is not how we do things in my culture. You are more than your fertility. The purpose of marriage is not children, but oneness, and children are a physical token of that oneness. You can choose to have a real marriage with Rachel if you will let go of this cultural practice, and I will bless every aspect of your life. Isaac already lived this. He didn't need a new name because his circumstances gave him the freedom to live according to God's law. Abram learned from experience that he should live according to God's law, and then he received his new name. It was a wrestle for Jacob to change his walk, to get aligned to God's law. But he did, and he was blessed for it. And those blessings extended to all of Israel's relationships. Esau's heart was totally softened. These brothers were twins, and twins have a special relationship. And here's how we know that when Jacob became Israel, he abandoned the work of polygamy. The only woman to bear any children by Israel, the one who changed his behavior so he could walk with God, is Rachel. After she died giving birth to Benjamin, Israel had no further posterity, despite being obviously virile, with socially approved access to fertile women. As I've said before, this is the exact same evidence we see with Joseph Smith. No biological children means that you can factually state that it is possible that Joseph, like covenant Abraham and covenant Israel, had 0 sexual encounters with any woman other than his one wife. Israel, like Abraham before him and countless followers of God after, found true rest and overcame the worldly tradition of polygamy through his covenantal relationship to God. I think Reuben's sexual encounter with Bilhah actually points to this. Here's why. If Israel had disavowed his spousal association with Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah, Reuben may have looked at his dad like, "What are you doing? Sure, Aunt Rachel died, but you've still got these other women. They belong to you. If you're not going to use them, I sure will." And remember, Reuben is Israel's oldest son. So if at that point Reuben assumed he was getting the birthright, that would mean he was expecting to get a double portion of his father's inheritance, and easily could have planned on receiving Bilhah, because Bilhah is a possession. And just as a side note, I believe Israel was sympathetic to Reuben's logic and forgave him, which I think in turn explains why Reuben tried so hard to protect Joseph from his brother's murderous intentions. As we try to discern polygamy's true nature, we have to look at the fruit. Look at Isaac and Rebekah's reaction to Esau's polygamy. Look at Jacob's disgust at being tricked into polygamy. Look at how everybody gets used in this system of slavery and polygamy, where some people are worth more than others. Look at Israel and Rachel's son, Joseph, who, as the firstborn son of Israel's covenant wife, received the right of the firstborn, and then, despite his tribulations, went on to become the second most powerful man in the most powerful nation in history to that point. He was not a polygamist. Joseph of Egypt's one wife was Asenath, and from those two, twain, descend Manasseh and Ephraim. Ancient Egypt was like most places. If you could afford more women, you could have more women. That's how the natural man works in a fallen world. But that's not how God works. That's not how God walks. How polygamy ever got twisted up into something godly, with all the witnesses we have, is beyond me. Honestly, the only explanation for it, in my opinion, is that Satan is real, and that he has a lot more power than we have been giving him credit for. He has the power to deceive us, all of us, and we have been deceived if we abandon Christ's teachings and instead believe this is a story about how God sanctions polygamy. Every single person you've seen as I've watched this cultural promenade is an individual that Christ deemed worth dying for. He did not come to condemn the world. Jesus Christ loves the world, and he came to save each of us and all the good that is in the world. Christ does not condemn any of the people that you see, myself included, for our wrong beliefs or understanding. He doesn't condemn us for being raised in a culture. He invites us to walk with him. We each need to get ourselves aligned so that we can walk with him, so that we can walk that straight and narrow path of judging sin, but not the sinner. Next time, we're going to wrap up biblical polygamy by discussing how to reconcile the law of Moses if polygamy is an abomination, how Moses can be a prophet if polygamy is an abomination, and how all those other kings and men who had many wives and concubines can be reconciled against God's law of marriage if polygamy is an abomination. And whether polygamy is an abomination is the real question that we must ask ourselves if we want to walk with Christ. And we don't have to be afraid of the answer, because it is either wheat or a tare. It cannot be both.